My sister accused me of stealing her $2,000 bracelet, and my parents kicked me out. I worked 3 jobs for 5 years while they disappeared. But when my grandmother changed her will and cut them all off to leave everything only to me, now they're begging and never saw coming what her rich boyfriend discovered. I'm 28 years old. I work in digital marketing for a mid-sized company, and what happened 5 years ago basically destroyed any illusion I had about what family meant. The thing is, I grew up thinking my parents were good people. You know, normal middle class, house in the suburbs, 2 daughters, the American dream and all that. But it turns out it was all a lie. Or at least it was for me from the time I was like 12 years old. My younger sister, Isabel, who's 3 years younger than me, was always the golden child, like the one who could do whatever without consequences, while I was basically invisible unless I did something wrong. And when I say I did something wrong, I didn't even do it. But we'll get to that. I guess everything started to change in 6th grade when I got my first bad grade. It was a C in math, nothing major really, but my parents acted like I'd burned the house down. I remember that night perfectly, because my father sat me down at the kitchen table and gave me this long speech about responsibility and effort, and my mother was standing there with her arms crossed, shaking her head like disappointed. Isabel was like 9 years old then and was in the living room watching TV, and I remember thinking, why can she watch TV while I'm getting this sermon for a C? But anyway, at that moment I thought it was normal. That parents are stricter with the firstborn or something like that. What I didn't understand until years later is that that night marked the beginning of a pattern that basically defined the rest of my life in that house. From there, everything went downhill for me. In middle school, Isabel started to shine. I mean, she was pretty, charismatic, popular, all those things that make parents feel proud to have a daughter like that. I wasn't ugly or anything, but I was quieter, more focused on my studies, less interested in being the center of attention. And my parents interpreted that as me being boring or something. When Isabel got a B, my parents congratulated her and took her out to dinner. When I got straight A's, I barely got a well done in passing. It sounds exaggerated, but it's literal. Like I could bring home a certificate of honor and my mother would say something like, "That's nice, honey," without even looking up from her phone. But if Isabel mentioned she'd been nominated for student council, it was like she'd won the Nobel Prize. Things got worse in high school. Isabel started dating Logan in her sophomore year, and this guy was the star quarterback of the football team, came from a super wealthy family, his father owned several car dealerships or something like that. My parents loved him, literally treated him better than me. Logan would come to dinner like 3 times a week, and my father would talk to him about sports and business like he was the son he never had, while I was there serving them food like I was the help. My mother even started asking Logan his opinion about things around the Mistari house. Like, what do you think if we paint the living room blue? As if his opinion mattered more than mine and I'd lived there my whole life. It was surreal. Isabel became unbearable with Logan by her side. She had this constant attitude of superiority. Like she'd won the lottery of life. And I was a loser for not having a rich and popular boyfriend. My parents constantly fed into that. I remember one time at dinner, I was like 17, and I mentioned that I'd gotten a summer internship at a local advertising agency, something I'd worked really hard to get. My father barely reacted, but when Isabel announced that Logan was taking her on a beach trip with his family, my parents almost jumped with excitement. My mother literally screamed and started planning what clothes Isabel needed to buy for the trip. I sat there thinking, seriously? This is my life? But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened when I was 23. I'd finished my 3rd year of college, was back home for the summer, working part-time at a coffee shop to save money, and Isabel was in her 1st year of college. She received this gold charm bracelet from Logan for her birthday. It was expensive. I think it cost like $2,000 or something ridiculous like that, and she wouldn't stop showing it off. She wore it every day, took pictures constantly. It was basically her most prized possession. And then one day, the bracelet disappeared. Isabel threw a fit like I'd never seen. She was crying, screaming, turning the whole house upside down looking for it. My parents went into total crisis mode, helping her search everywhere. I was in my room studying for an exam when Isabel came in furious and accused me directly of stealing it. I was in shock, like literally, with my mouth open, unable to process what she was saying. She started screaming that I'd always been jealous of her, that I hated seeing her happy with Logan, that I'd probably sold it or hidden. it out of spite. I tried to defend myself, but she wouldn't let me talk. And then my parents arrived. What happened next was probably the most painful moment of my life. My parents didn't even ask for my side of the story. My father looked at me with this expression of disappointment and disgust that I'll never forget and said, "Catherine, we know it was you." I tried to explain that I hadn't touched that bracelet, that I didn't even care about it, that why would I do something like that? But my mother interrupted and said she'd always known I had problems with envy, that it had been obvious since we were kids that I resented Isabel for being more successful and loved. Those were her exact words, more successful and loved. I felt like I'd been stabbed. My father then gave me an ultimatum. You have 24 hours to return the bracelet and apologize to your sister, or you leave this house and don't come back. I was crying by that point, begging them to believe me. But Isabel was standing there with her arms crossed with this expression of satisfaction that made me realize something horrible. She knew I hadn't stolen it. This was intentional. I don't know if she hid it or really lost it and decided to blame me, but in that moment, I saw in her eyes that this was exactly what she wanted, an excuse for our parents to finally kick me out. I didn't return the bracelet because obviously I didn't have it. 24 hours later, my father literally took my things from my room, put them in suitcases and trash bags, and placed them at the entrance. He told me I wasn't welcome in his house until I admitted what I'd done and apologized. I remember standing there on the porch with all my stuff. It was July and it was scorching hot, and my mother closed the door in my face without even looking at me. Isabel was watching from the living room window with Logan by her side, and I swear I saw a smile on her face. I called my only friend who had an apartment at that time, and she let me sleep on her couch for 2 weeks until I got a horrible little room in a building that was basically falling apart. I worked 3 jobs during the next year to pay rent and finish college. Waitress at night, barista in the mornings, and administrative assistant on weekends. I slept like 4 hours a night. I lost almost 20 pounds in 3 months because I barely had money to eat. But I graduated, because I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me fail. During those 5 years, the only person from my family who contacted me was my grandmother, my father's mother. She called me every week, sent me money when she could, although she didn't have much herself, invited me to lunch every 2 months. She never asked me about the bracelet, never judged me. She just supported me. She'd say things like, "I know who you are, Catherine, and I know you're a good person." Those conversations kept me sane. Honestly, my parents never contacted me. Not a call, not a message, nothing. At my college graduation, my grandmother was the only one who attended. I saw other families taking pictures with their kids, hugging them, proud, and I had my 75-year-old grandmother who had driven 2 hours to be there. Don't get me wrong, I was grateful for her, but it hurt like you have no idea to see those empty spaces where my parents should have been. Isabel graduated a year after me, and according to my grandmother, my parents threw a huge party, invited like 50 people, hired catering. I had my grandmother and bought pizza. I built my life little by little. I got a decent job in marketing, moved to a better apartment, made new friends who became my chosen family. I went to therapy to process everything because I basically had severe trust issues after what happened. My therapist helped me understand that none of it had been my fault, that my parents had shown toxic favoritism for years, and that the bracelet situation was just the excuse they needed to continue their pattern of mistreatment. That helped, but the pain never completely went away, you know. Then came December last year, 5 years after they kicked me out. I received an invitation from my grandmother to Christmas dinner at her house. She had this dinner every year, and all the extended family went. Uncles, cousins, everyone. I'd never gone in those 5 years, because I knew my parents and Isabel would be there. And frankly, I didn't want to see them. But my grandmother called me personally and begged me to go, said it meant a lot to her, and that she was getting older and didn't know how many more Christmases she had left. And that broke my heart, so I agreed to go. The night of the dinner, I arrived with my stomach in knots. The moment I entered my grandmother's house and saw my parents and Isabel, the air got heavy. My mother looked at me and literally turned her face away. My father didn't even greet me. Isabel was there with Logan still, surprisingly, and she shot me, this look of pure hatred. But my grandmother welcomed me with a huge hug and introduced me to the rest of the family as if nothing had happened, which was awkward because everyone knew what had happened, but nobody said anything. Dinner was tense at first. I sat as far away as possible from my parents and Isabel. My grandmother kept the conversation light, asking everyone about their lives, their jobs, that kind of thing. When it was my turn, I talked about my job in marketing, and my grandmother was super proud, telling everyone about my achievements. I noticed my mother rolling her eyes and my father looking bored. Isabel was on her phone, completely ignoring me. After dinner, when we were all in the living room, my grandmother stood up and said she had something important to do. She went to her room and came back with a blue velvet box. The room went silent because everyone recognized that box. Inside was the family locket that had been passed down for generations in my father's family. It was a beautiful heirloom, antique, with a gold locket that had my great-grandmother's initials engraved. It wasn't just valuable in monetary terms. It was the symbol of who would inherit the main family assets. My grandmother stood in front of me and gave me the box. "Catherine," she said with a clear voice so everyone could hear, "I want you to have this. You've proven to be the most responsible and person with integrity in this family, and I trust you'll honor the family legacy. I also want you to know that I've updated my will. Everything I have, the house, the savings, the investments, everything will go to you when I'm gone." The silence that followed was deafening. I opened the box with trembling hands, and there was the locket, shining under the Christmas lights. I started crying. I couldn't help it. My grandmother hugged me and whispered in my ear, "I always knew the truth, honey." And then, as if someone had pressed a button, my parents and Isabel suddenly wanted to talk to me. My mother came over with this fake smile and said something like, "Catherine, honey, we've missed you so much. We should talk about what happened. Maybe we misinterpreted things." My father nodded vigorously and added that family should be together, especially at Christmas. Isabel even tried to hug me, saying she'd been immature years ago and that she wanted to rebuild our sisterly relationship. It was so obvious, so pathetically obvious what was happening. They didn't care about me or what they'd done to me. They only cared about the money. The locket meant inheritance. Meant my grandmother's house in a neighborhood that had appreciated like crazy in recent years. It meant her savings that I knew were considerable, because my grandfather had been very careful with finances before he died. My grandmother saw my expression and knew exactly what I was thinking. She addressed the room and told everyone that for years she'd observed how they treated Catherine, how they'd discarded her without even questioning the version of events, how they never worried about whether she was okay after kicking her out. She said Catherine had worked 3 jobs to survive, while they lived comfortably without a second thought for her, and that now they wanted reconciliation only because there was money involved, and that was unacceptable. My parents tried to defend themselves, saying I'd stolen the bracelet and that they'd only done the right thing, but my grandmother interrupted them and said something that left me frozen. "I found that bracelet 3 years ago in Isabel's drawer, when I was staying at your house, taking care of her while you were traveling. It was in the bottom of her jewelry box, wrapped in a handkerchief." Isabel lied. Everyone turned to look at Isabel, who went pale as a ghost. She started stammering something about having found it later, but that it was too late to say anything. But nobody believed her. Everyone could see the guilt on her face. I left there that night feeling a mixture of vindication and rage. Vindication because finally the truth had come out, but rage because 5 years had passed. 5 years of my life, where I struggled alone, where I cried myself to sleep, where I questioned my own worth as a person, and it had all been because of a lie that they decided to believe without even giving me the benefit of the doubt. The following days were crazy. My parents started calling me and sending me messages constantly, asking to talk, that we needed to heal as a family. Isabel sent me this long, tearful message saying she'd made a terrible mistake when she was young and that she hoped I could forgive her. But what really disgusted me was when she showed up at my apartment a week later without warning, my parents and her, knocking on my door at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I opened the door because the doorbell wouldn't stop ringing and my neighbors were getting annoyed. My mother immediately tried to come in, but I blocked the entrance. She started with this speech about how family is the most important thing and that mistakes of the past should stay in the past. My father said we should start over. Forget what happened. Isabel was crying, saying she missed me. I told them to leave. I told them they'd had 5 years to look for me, to apologize, to try to fix things, but they only cared when they found out there was money involved. My mother then got hysterical, saying I was ungrateful, that they'd raised me and fed me for 18 years, and that I owed them respect. My father tried to push the door to get in, and I had to threaten to call building security. They wouldn't leave. Literally, they stayed there, knocking on the door, yelling through it. for almost an hour. I finally called security and they had to escort them out of the building. My mother was screaming things like, "This is how you treat your own mother," and "You'll regret this," as they were being taken out. It was a scene. Several neighbors came out to see what was happening. It was humiliating but also liberating in some twisted way, like I no longer had to pretend we were a functional family. Isabel then decided to get creative. She sent a mass message to a group chat that included several of my friends and mutual acquaintances from years ago, telling her version of the story where I was the villain who had abandoned my family, that I was now trying to steal the inheritance from my grandmother by manipulating her because she was elderly, and that they just wanted reconciliation, but I was too proud and resentful to accept their apologies. Some of those friends contacted me confused because the story didn't match what they knew about me, but others, especially those who didn't know me that well, probably believed her. My grandmother found out about that and got furious. She organized a meeting with all the extended family, uncles, cousins, everyone, and there she told the whole truth. She explained how she'd witnessed the favoritism for years, how they'd kicked me out based on a lie, how I'd survived alone without their help, and how now that there was inheritance involved, they suddenly wanted to be family again. She also showed them messages my parents had sent her, pressuring her to change her will, basically admitting that their interest in me was purely financial. That was a turning point. Several of my uncles and cousins who had been cold to me contacted me to apologize. They said my parents had told them their version of the story for years, painting me as a rebellious and problematic daughter who had stolen and left out of pride. Now they understood the truth and felt bad for having judged me without knowing all the facts. The ironic thing is that Logan, Isabel's star boyfriend, left her like 2 months after all this. Apparently, he'd been with her partially because he thought she came from a family with money and stability. Her parents had a nice house. Her grandmother was wealthy. Everything looked good. But when it became clear that Isabel had lied about the bracelet, that her parents were basically toxic, and that the family inheritance wasn't going to be hers, Logan suddenly lost interest. Also, according to a cousin who told me, Isabel started having horrible tantrums about the whole inheritance situation, and Logan got fed up with her behavior. He left her by text message, which is cold, but considering how Isabel is, it was probably the safest thing for him. Isabel apparently had a breakdown after that. My mother called me crying, telling me that Isabel was devastated, that she'd lost Logan, and that now the family was destroyed because of me. She begged me to tell my grandmother to reconsider the will, that it wasn't fair for Isabel to be left with nothing. I hung up on her in the middle of her crying. My parents made one last attempt like 2 months ago. They sent me a handwritten letter, which is funny because they'd never been the letter-writing type, but I guess they wanted it to look more personal and sincere. The letter said everything you'd expect: how much they loved me, how much they regretted what happened, how they'd made mistakes but that family should forgive each other, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the letter, there was a paragraph about how they were going through financial difficulties, how my father was considering retirement soon and they needed to plan their future, and how they hoped I would consider the needs of the whole family when my grandmother eventually passed away. There it was again. They couldn't even fake it properly. Even in their apology letter, what they really cared about was the money. I didn't tear up the letter or anything dramatic. I just threw it in the trash and went on with my day. My grandmother is fine now, still going strong at 76. I see her every 2 weeks for lunch, and she's the only family I need, honestly. She tells me not to feel bad about cutting contact with my parents and Isabel, that she completely understands my decision and supports it. She says what they did to me was unforgivable and that they don't deserve my forgiveness just because it's convenient for them now. Sometimes I think about what it would be like if I gave them another chance, if I tried to have some kind of relationship with them. But then I remember that night when I was 23 years old, standing on the porch with all my belongings in trash bags, watching my mother close the door in my face without looking back. I remember working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night. I remember crying in the bathroom of the coffee shop where I worked because I was so tired and so alone and so broken. And I remember that in all those 5 years, when I really needed a family, when I needed someone to tell me everything was going to be okay, they weren't there. Not because they couldn't find me, but because they didn't care enough to try. Now that there's money involved, now that my grandmother chose me over them, suddenly I'm their daughter again. Isabel wants to be my sister again. But you know what? It doesn't work that way. You can't disappear during the worst years of someone's life and then show up when it's convenient for you, expecting everything to be forgiven and forgotten. My therapist says I'm within my rights to set boundaries and that I have no obligation to maintain toxic relationships just because I share DNA with those people. She's right. I've built a life without them. A good life with friends, who became family, with a career I like, with my grandmother who was always there. I don't need them, and I definitely don't need their drama or their sudden interest in me motivated by greed. The last time I talked to my mother was 3 weeks ago. She called me from an unknown number because I have all her known numbers blocked, like she was determined. I answered without thinking, and she immediately started with how she just wanted to hear my voice, that she missed me. That kind of thing. She sounded almost sincere, until she said something about how it would be nice if we could work together to take care of my grandmother in her final years and make sure she was comfortable. She said it in a way that made it clear that working together meant she wanted to be involved in decisions about my grandmother's money and probably get something for her and my father. I told her my grandmother was perfectly fine, that I would take care of her when she needed help, and that she didn't have to worry because she wasn't going to have any role in that. She got angry then and started saying I was being vindictive and cruel, that I was punishing them for a mistake they made years ago. I told her I wasn't punishing them, I was simply living my life without toxic people in it, and that if that bothered them, it was their problem, not mine. She hung up, furious. Do I feel anything for them? Sometimes, in rare moments, I feel something that could be pity. I think about how my parents are now these bitter people who destroyed the relationship with one of their daughters because of favoritism and pride, and that now they're desperate trying to fix it only because they realize the financial consequences. I think about Isabel, who lost her boyfriend, and probably realized that her lies have real consequences. But that feeling of pity lasts like 5 seconds before I remember everything they did to me, and then it disappears. My grandmother told me something a few weeks ago that's been going around in my head. She said that real family isn't the one that shares your blood, it's the one that's there when things get tough. The one that supports you without conditions, the one that doesn't disappear when you need them most. And she's right. I have family, my grandmother, my close friends, who helped me when I had nothing. My therapist who helped me heal. Those are the people who matter. The other day, a friend asked me if I thought I'd ever forgive my parents and Isabel. I told her honestly I don't know. Forgiveness is complicated, and I'm not sure they deserve it, especially considering their repentance is completely fake and motivated by self-interest. Maybe someday, if they ever show genuine regret that has nothing to do with money or inheritances, I could consider having some kind of superficial relationship with them. But forgiving what they did, forgetting those 5 years of hell I lived because of them, accepting them back into my life as if nothing had happened, that's not going to happen. And I'm at peace with that.